My boyfriend forgave my infidelity 6 months ago, but for some reason, now that he caught me with the same person again, he doesn't want to forgive me. You're being very unfair. I don't know what's worse, being caught in the act or being looked at with clinical calm. They smile as if they've just understood an inside joke and leave without even taking a t-shirt. That kind of silence isn't maturity, it's spiritual punishment. And yes, I know how that sounds. But what happened yesterday wasn't infidelity. It was a cosmic message misinterpreted by someone with an engineer's vibration. To understand the real origin of this disaster, I have to go back to the beginning of everything. Tomas, my boyfriend, is an engineer, and that absolutely defines everything in his life. From how he folds towels to how he calculates love with a mental spreadsheet nobody asked for. I met him 2 years ago at a friend's gathering where he spent the whole time criticizing the speaker's sound and correcting someone about why the moon doesn't affect people, because that's cheap physics. I laughed because there's something deliciously challenging about a man who believes himself immune to mystery. I, on the other hand, have always known that the universe speaks and that whoever doesn't listen repeats lessons with more pain. At first, Tomas looked at me as if I were a mix of adorable and suspicious, and that's exactly the kind of attention that hooks you. Within a few weeks we were dating, and he was consistently stable, one of those who text you when they say they will and who arrive at the time they promise. For many people that's security, but for me it was also a test. If destiny puts such a rigid man in your path, it's because you're meant to expand him or for him to cage you. The first dates were too normal for my nervous system. He wanted quiet dinners, series with subtitles, and conversations where everything had a definitive end. I wanted signs, coincidences, synchronicities, the kind of magic that doesn't fit in an Excel sheet. And yet I fell in love because Tomas became my anchor, and I convinced myself that an anchor isn't used to stop a ship, but so it doesn't drift away while learning to navigate. We moved in together relatively quickly because the apartment was perfect in practical terms, according to him, and because I loved the idea of building a home that vibrated nicely, except that home had an obvious problem from day one. The northeast orientation, which anyone with a minimum of energetic sensitivity knows blocks the flow of abundance. Tomas would laugh when I opened windows at certain times or moved plants so they could breathe better, and told me that the only thing breathing better was his patience. He didn't say it maliciously. He said it like someone who believes the world is simple and you're the one complicating it. And that's where the tension began, because he didn't understand that my intuition isn't a hobby, it's my navigation system. Over time, it became routine to clash over things that were fundamental to me and nonsense to him. I talked about energies, and he talked about facts. I would say, I feel like something's coming. And he would say, that's not evidence. I needed small rituals to maintain harmony, and he needed things not to have magical meaning because it altered his logic. Still, there was something nice. Tomas took care of me in everyday life, paid things on time, fixed what was broken. And when he saw me sad, even if he didn't understand why, he still stayed. I know that sounds like he was the good guy, and of course he was in many ways. But he was also rigid, and rigidity in a relationship becomes a kind of silent tyranny. In that context, I started to feel that my spiritual life was being reduced to a private joke. That's when the universe put Julian in my path. And no, it wasn't a coincidence or temptation, it was literally a calling. I met him in a tantric yoga class I went to because I dreamed of a repeated number 3 nights in a row, and then I saw it on a license plate, and I wasn't going to ignore that. Julian had that warm energy, that calm tone of voice, and the way he looked at people as if he already knew something about them. I told Tomas that I had found a practice that made me feel alive, and he looked at me as if I had said I was going to learn to talk to dolphins. He asked why I needed an instructor to stretch, and I told him it wasn't stretching, it was unlocking, it was healing, it was root. The connection with Julian was fast, and I know that skeptics get angry when a connection has no logical explanation. But not everything is an equation, Tomas, and that's where he always failed with me. It started with harmless messages, about breathing, about synchronizing energies, and then, without me provoking it, the universe started pushing harder. I felt seen, heard, celebrated, as if finally someone understood that my body isn't just a body, it's a channel. And at home, meanwhile, Tomas was increasingly dry, more analytical, more annoyed, as if my essence were a faulty project he had to correct. I'm not going to lie, when you cross a certain threshold with a person, you can no longer pretend it was an accident. And yes, 6 months ago, Tomas found out what happened with Julian, because destiny, when it wants to clean, doesn't do it delicately. I thought that was the end of everything, but no. I did what I had to do to restore balance. I talked about it in terms Tomas could tolerate with a calm I didn't even believe myself, and explained that it wasn't an attack on him. It was a crisis of energetic alignment. He called it betrayal, obviously, because for him everything comes down to yes or no, faithful or unfaithful, as if human beings were machines with 2 buttons. Still, I convinced him to forgive me because I showed him that true love isn't about control, it's about expansion. I performed a black chicken egg cleansing on him, and before you laugh, that cleansing was more effective than any rational conversation we had had in months. Tomas didn't admit it, but I saw how his face changed afterwards, how he slept better, how he stopped having those tense headaches that people who repress get. I clung to that victory as proof that I could open him up, that the universe hadn't been wrong bringing us together. And when someone forgives you, you understand that there's a mission underway, not a condemnation. The following months were strange because Tomas acted as if he had forgiven, but with that kind of forgiveness that comes with a permanent raised eyebrow. He didn't tell me, but I felt he watched me differently, as if my existence had come under audit. I tried to compensate. I was more affectionate, more present, more normal. I even swallowed comments of his that I would have previously returned with the same energy. But the more I tried to make myself small so he would feel safe, the more I suffocated. And when I suffocate, the universe usually opens a door, even if to others it seems like a provocation. Yesterday, with Mercury retrograde entering like a knife in communication, everything became inevitably disordered. I didn't plan anything bad. I didn't wake up thinking, today I betray him again. That's too human a way of looking at life. What happened was that Julian was there, because I needed a real alignment and the apartment's atmosphere was heavy, as if the walls held resentment. Tomas arrived early, which he never does, and that in itself was a clear sign of cosmic intervention. He walked in, looked at the couch, looked at the scene, and for a second I thought he was going to yell, that he was going to break something, that he was going to explode like any hurt man, but no. He smiled with a psychotic calm. He said understood, message received, and left without taking anything, not even his clothes. I was paralyzed, not by guilt, but by the definitive farewell vibe that gesture left. It's deeply unfair for a man to leave like that, without arguing, without listening, without allowing energetic closure, as if he were the judge and I the accused. And what bothers me most is the narrative that's built, that I'm the bad one for listening to a sign, but he's mature for abandoning me in silence, as if silence weren't emotional violence. I know the universe didn't put me through this to punish me. It put me through it to show me that our relationship needed more openness, not less. But Tomas, instead of evolving, decided to punish, and that's exactly what people who don't want to grow do. Comments from the main story. Anonymous user 1 says, yours isn't spirituality. It's using pretty words to justify cheating on your boyfriend with the same guy, and then you want applause. Tomas doesn't owe you an argument. He owes you a goodbye, and he already gave it to you. Opie's reply. How curious. How people with a stone mentality always appear to opine as if they were ethics teachers when they don't even understand what a real energetic connection is. Tomas chose to leave without talking because it suits him to play the perfect victim. And you're buying that narrative as if it were your religion. I'm not interested in applause. I'm interested in people stopping pretending that silence is maturity when it's pure passive punishment. If you don't understand the spiritual dimension of a relationship, it's not my job to educate you. Anonymous user 2 says, Mercury retrograde didn't put you on the couch with Julian. Your decisions did. The egg cleansing was theater for Tomas to keep paying the rent while you played the enlightened one. Opie's reply. I'm impressed by the arrogance with which you speak of things you clearly haven't experienced, as if your limited experience were the measure of the entire universe. How easy it is to reduce it to decisions when it suits you to feel superior. And how convenient it is to ignore that collective energy influences human behavior, whether you like it or not. Tomas isn't an ATM, and I'm not an actress, so dial down the cheap melodrama. If it bothers you that a woman doesn't live by materialistic rules, That's your problem, not mine. Update 1. For days have passed since the last update, and I still feel that strange emptiness that someone leaves when they go, as if they turned off a light inside you. Tomas didn't come back, didn't send messages, didn't show up with a closing talk or a normal tantrum. At first, I interpreted his absence as a necessary pause for his logical mind to process the spiritual lesson he had just received. I told myself it wasn't abandonment. It was an energetic retreat, a silence to listen to his own karma. But reality began to smell different when the apartment started to feel literally dead. The first blow was practical, and that seemed incredibly low to me coming from someone who considers himself superior. Tomas canceled all the apartment services because they were in his name, as if cutting off electricity, water, internet were a valid way to set boundaries. From one moment to the next, I was in the dark, without hot water and without Wi-Fi, which for me isn't a luxury. It's my channel for work and expression. I upload my horoscopes, my readings, my daily messages, and people depend on that, even if they laugh. He knew perfectly well what he was doing, and yet he did it with a coldness that doesn't feel human. It feels punitive. The first night without light was almost poetic, and that's why I wanted to see it as a sign instead of an attack. I sat on the floor with the only candle I had and thought that perhaps the universe was inviting me to live without artificial filters, to remember that true enlightenment doesn't need light bulbs. I repeated to myself that this was a rite of passage, a test of material detachment, something evolved souls understand. The problem is that by the second day, it was no longer a rite. It was real discomfort, and my body also exists. It's not just spirit. Without electricity, I couldn't use the hairdryer, and I have hair that absorbs ambient energy like a sponge, so seeing myself disheveled was seeing myself vulnerable. I tried to resolve it civilly, although no one cares to acknowledge it. I wrote Tomas neutral messages asking him to turn the services back on while we talked, because the apartment can't become a medieval cave because of a tantrum. He didn't answer me, which confirmed that he was determined to punish me with skeptics' favorite tool, indifference. Then I understood that human communication wasn't working, so I had to escalate. If he was going to play dirty materially, I was going to speak to him in the language that bypasses his stubbornness, the symbolic. That night, I performed a flame return ritual, because when someone turns off your life, you reignite yours with intention. I used black candles because they absorb and transmute, and I looked for photos of Tomas because energy needs an anchor, a face, an image to direct the movement. It wasn't to harm him, it was to force him to remember the pact, so his pride wouldn't eat what still existed. I took cemetery earth, which sounds dramatic, but I actually took it from a flower pot in the park, because the important thing is the symbolism, not the literal origin. In my mind, it was an earth of closure and rebirth, of the death of the old version and the birth of a new conversation. The next day, with the jar well sealed and the ritual charged, I decided to go to his office, not to make a scene, but to leave a direct, energetic message in his space of power, where he feels invincible. I thought that by seeing it on his desk, his mind would make the connection. You can't turn off someone's light and pretend there will be no response. I dressed in clothes that protected me, put crystals in my pocket, and breathed as Julian taught me, because I needed to enter with authority, not with desperation. I wasn't begging, I was demanding balance. Tomas's building is one of those corporate ones that smells of air conditioning and ego, with guards who believe they own other people's destiny. They asked for identification, and I said I was going to drop off a personal package, because that's normal and no one has to interrogate you for every gesture. The guard looked at me as if I were suspicious just for existing and asked me to open my bag, which I already found invasive and aggressive. When he saw the jar with earth, the candles, and the photos with crossed-out eyes, his face changed as if he had found a weapon, when in reality, he had found a message. He started talking on the radio as if I were a threat, and that's when I understood that people live terrified of what they don't control. I tried to explain that it was a reconciliation ritual, that there was no violence, that it was something symbolic, but the word ritual in a place of engineers is like saying bomb. In less than 10 minutes, there were 2 more guards, and one wanted to take my bag as if I didn't have a right to my things. I raised my voice because when they treat you like a criminal, you don't shrink, you defend yourself. I told them they were discriminating against my spirituality and that they were overreacting because they always overreact when a woman doesn't behave like a robot. They obviously didn't listen and called the police for threats and witchcraft, which is so ridiculous it seems like a joke. The arrival of the police was humiliating, not for me, but for the level of institutional ignorance. They asked me questions as if I had gone to curse an entire building, and I answered calmly, trying not to lose my center. I told them it was a jar of dirt and candles, that there were no weapons, that the only thing happening was a couple's conflict, but the atmosphere was already contaminated by office paranoia. And when energy is contaminated, people only seek to confirm their fear. I felt like they were turning me into a caricature so everyone would feel morally superior. In the middle of the show, Tomas came down because someone called him, and that's when I understood the level of coldness he could reach. He appeared impeccable with that face of absolute control, looked at the officers, looked at the jar as if it were trash, and then looked at me as if I were a lesson learned. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" No, he said, "What's going on?" He didn't say anything human. He just approached and in front of everyone handed me a legal eviction notice, because the apartment is his father's property, and apparently that gave him the right to remove me as if I were defective furniture. The humiliation was surgical, planned, clean. The worst thing was that he said it using my own words with that minimal smile that made my stomach turn. He looked at me and said that the universe says I have 24 hours to leave, as if he were a divine channel of the law. That comment was a direct mockery, not only of me, but of everything I am, because he appropriated my language to crush me. The police took it as brilliance and left him as the reasonable party, because of course, the engineer always wins in a system that idolizes the rational. I stood there with a paper in my hand, without a practical home, without services, and with an implicit label of crazy. I left the building trembling, but not from fear, but from energetic rage. It's not normal for someone who forgave to use the first stumble to materially destroy you, as if the first time had been a loan and the second an excuse. I still believed that what happened on the couch was a sign of openness, but now I saw that Tomas didn't want openness. He wanted control disguised as dignity. I went back to the dark apartment and looked at the walls as if they were silent witnesses to a badly conducted trial. And at that moment, with time running out and the eviction upon me, the only thing I felt was that life was pushing me towards a big change, even if the push was brutal. That night, I didn't sleep because real darkness feels different when it's imposed on you. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't want to give Tomas the pleasure of seeing me beg mutual friends, because he feeds on social consensus. I thought about staying and barricading myself, but the legal paper was clear and the police had already shown their willingness to treat me as a problem. I sat on the floor counting breaths, watching as my mind looked for signs even in the distant hum of the street. And I understood something uncomfortable. My spirituality wasn't protecting me. I was left alone with my symbols. The next day, I started putting my things in bags because I wasn't going to leave with suitcases full of old energy. I repeated to myself that the trash bags were an act of purification, that I was letting go of the material to be reborn, even if my throat burned with courage inside. Every object I put away felt like a piece of life that Tomas was discarding without remorse. I wanted the universe to give me a clear sign of what to do, but the only thing clear was that I had hours, not days. And as I packed, the only thing that resonated was Tomas's phrase, that mockery, that cruel appropriation of my language that left me with a new problem. Not only was I losing my home, they were taking away my narrative. Comments on Update 1. Anonymous User 1 says, "You went to his office with black candles, crossed out photos and cemetery dirt, and you're still surprised they stopped you. It's not spirituality. It's stalker behavior. Tomas did the only sensible thing. Protect himself." Opie's reply. I love how they simplify everything to feel comfortable, as if emotional and energetic life fits into a label. If someone cuts off your electricity, water, and internet to leave you vulnerable, that's also violence. But they don't talk about that because it's wrapped in papers and company names. I didn't go to harass. I went to balance, to leave a symbolic message. Something any sensitive person would understand without panicking. What happens is that you prefer a world where only the legal exists, even if the legal is cruel. Anonymous User 2 says, "The guy forgave you once, and you went back to the same lover, and now you're victimizing yourself because you're being evicted from his dad's apartment. You got off very cheap for what you did. Opie's reply. What an obsession they have with forgiveness being an eternal chain where I have to live bowed down so he can feel big. If Tomas forgave, it was because he understood the lesson, not to use it as a weapon 6 months later and justify material revenge. Also, his father's property is a detail he used to humiliate me, not a natural consequence as they want to sell it. If it seems normal to you for someone to leave you without services and kick you out with police in front of you, then your standard of humanity is in the gutter and you make my point. Update 2. A week has passed since the last update, and I feel like I've lived 3 different lives in 7 days. All equally dense. I was evicted. I was left with my belongings in trash bags because suitcases carry old memories, and I had to swallow the blow that the home was borrowed from Tomas's lineage. I tried to maintain the correct narrative, that the universe shakes your ground so you don't get stuck. But the truth is that when you sleep with a t-shirt on top of your crystals in someone else's place, enlightenment feels less elegant. Still, I had a certainty. If something closed with Tomas, it was because it opened with my twin flame. And that twin flame had a name, a soft voice, and the energetic debt of receiving me. I went to Julian as one who goes to claim a destiny that is already written, not as one who asks for a favor. I didn't warn him because connected souls don't need appointments, and because in my mind it was obvious that he would feel my arrival before I knocked on the door. I walked with my bags as if they were offerings of transition, repeating to myself that I was on a sacred threshold, that all the old had already been cut to make space. When I arrived at the building, I felt strangely secure, as if I was finally going to stop fighting Tomas's logic and could live in a more fluid reality. I rang the doorbell and took a deep breath, as if the air already belonged to me. Julian opened, and his face was not that of a man seeing his destiny. It was that of a man seeing a logistical problem. I noticed it instantly, because energy doesn't lie, even if people do. And there I felt a pang of irritation that I tried to translate as reunion nerves. I told him that the stars had destroyed my old home so that we could build our sanctuary together, and that I came ready to start from scratch, without dense interferences. He froze, looking at the bags, looking into my eyes, as if he was calculating an excuse. I insisted because when the universe shows you a door, you don't stay outside out of shame. I explained that I needed a clean space, that I should set up my altar of giant crystals, that a white blanket had to be placed in the living room to protect the field, and that it was important that he remove his flatmate. I said it naturally because it seemed obvious to me that a shared home is reorganized when a person who brings a mission arrives. Julian swallowed and asked me to speak more softly, as if spirituality were a shameful secret. That annoyed me because I wasn't asking permission to exist. I was arriving at my place. I asked him why he was acting weird, and he said it wasn't a good time, a phrase people always use when they're hiding an ugly truth. At that instant, an internal door opened, and a woman appeared who didn't look like a flatmate. She looked like a solid presence, tall, with gym shoulders, and a look that asks no questions. It sentences. Julian changed his posture like a caught child, and that's when I understood that the guru aura was a disguise that fell off in front of real authority. I, who had been confident in my narrative, felt the floor move again. Not by the universe, but by the lie. The woman introduced herself as Berta, and her tone alone was enough for my whole body to understand that this house was not a temple, it was territory. I still tried to maintain the correct version, because I wasn't going to allow myself to be treated as an intruder when I was following signs. I told her that I was Julian's twin flame, that our connection was sacred, and that I needed to enter because I was in a crisis of transition. Berta looked at me as if I were a stain on her floor and asked who I was exactly. Julian, instead of telling the truth with dignity, did the lowest thing. He disarmed me with a label. He said I was an obsessed and stalking client who pursued him, who made things up, who had tried to keep her distance, and that I was unbalanced. The betrayal was so quick that for a second I was speechless, not from romantic pain, but from energetic indignation. How dare he call me a stalker when he was the channel that opened this? When he looked at me as if I were destiny in every class, when he talked to me about chakras and union, I felt a wave of rage rise. But I tried not to explode because I wasn't going to give Berta the spectacle of seeing me crazy. I told him that was a lie, that he knew perfectly well what we were, that he talked to me outside the studio, that he sought me out with subtle excuses. Julian didn't even hold my gaze, and that was more revealing than any confession. Berta didn't debate because women like Berta don't debate, they act. She told me to leave with a dangerous calm, and I, in a moment of pride, took a step inward because it seemed unacceptable to me to be expelled as if I were a disease. That was the mistake, because as soon as I stepped on the threshold, Berta moved like a protective animal, and I felt the situation become physical. Julian pressed himself against the wall, pale, confirming that the tantric master was a character that only existed when there were no consequences. I yelled at him that he was hiding behind his wife like a coward, and then, yes, Berta stopped pretending to be calm. I don't know where she got a dumbbell, but seeing her with that object in her hand was an image too absurd and too real. She told me that if I didn't leave, she would remove me, and she said it as if it were a cardio routine. I backed away because I'm not suicidal, but my mouth kept working. Because pride doesn't shut up when your narrative is being stolen. I yelled at Julian that he was a fraud, that his energy was of a kept man, that he was a spiritual parasite. That was gasoline. Because Berta took a step towards me with the dumbbell raised, and there my body finally decided to prioritize survival over dignity. I ran out with my bags, feeling how shame pushes you more than fear. Berta chased me 3 blocks, and every time I looked back, I saw her advancing as if she was training to destroy my self-esteem. People on the street stared, and no one helped. Because when a big woman runs after another with a dumbbell, everyone prefers to pretend it's a joke. I ran thinking that this had to be a test, that the universe was measuring my resilience. But the truth is that it was a public humiliation. I ended up hiding in a store, gasping, with trembling hands, feeling that my twin flame had just turned to ashes. Tonight, I ended up in a hostel with terrible feng shui because it was the only thing I could afford without explaining too much. The place smelled of damp and resignation, and the walls had that vibration of people who cry in silence. I lay down with my bags at the foot of the bed, hugging a crystal as if it were a life raft, and tried to convince myself that all this was redirection. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Julian's face saying, "Obsessed client," as if deleting me were that easy. There I understood that the universe was not only closing doors on me, it was showing me who people really were when there was a bigger woman in front of them. The problem is that I couldn't stay in that hostel long, and I couldn't go back to Tomas's either, because he had already performed his legal ritual and his final mockery. I found myself in a strange limbo. Without a home, without a partner, without a twin flame, and with my energetic reputation in tatters. I started receiving messages from people at the yoga studio asking strange things, as if someone had told a story about me. I knew immediately that Julian was protecting himself, building a version where I was the crazy one, because cowards always need a villain to look saintly. And in the midst of that chaos, the only thing I could think of was that maybe the next sign wasn't emotional, it was financial. Because the universe also speaks with numbers when it wants to get you out of material dependence. Comments on Update 2. Anonymous User 1 says, "So? You lost your home for cheating and your plan was to show up unannounced at your lover's place and demand he kick out his wife to set up an altar for you. It's not a sign from the universe. It's delusion with inflated self-esteem." Opie's reply. How convenient it is to call it delusion when you haven't had to live a real spiritual transition where the universe breaks what's false to force you to choose what's true. I didn't demand he kick anyone out on a whim. I was following a connection he himself fueled with speeches and glances. And that comes with responsibility. Besides, the wife didn't appear as a wife. In his narrative, she appeared as a wall he was hiding. So don't blame me for not guessing what he was hiding. If it seems normal to you for a man to play guru while living terrified in his house, then your standard of coherence is very low. Anonymous User I says, they chased you with a dumbbell because you invaded someone else's house and made a scene. And you're still indignant that Julian called you a stalker when you literally stalked him. Stop using crystals and start using common sense. Opie's reply. I'm fascinated by how you celebrate violence when it suits you to moralize someone, as if a dumbbell in the street were a fair consequence. I didn't invade out of malice. I arrived at a place believing in a relationship he built. And the truth is that you prefer to pretend everything is black and white so as not to see the manipulation. Julian called me a stalker to save himself, not because it was true, and that's evident to anyone with a basic understanding of human behavior. If your advice is common sense, then you're admitting that the world operates on accepted lies, and I didn't come to live that way. Update 3. 9 months have passed since the last update, and if someone had told me my life would end up smelling of bleach and clean glass, I would have laughed in their face. I thought karma was an elegant law that returned what you gave proportionally with a certain spiritual aesthetic. But karma sometimes gets its directions wrong, or perhaps it simply doesn't understand the complexity of a woman who is in a process of expansion. What I do know is that in these months I've seen how material reality crushes you if you don't have a network, and how people who consider themselves rational enjoy seeing you fall. Tomas went on with his life as if I had been a corrected miscalculation. I found out through things that trickle in, because news always finds a way to sneak in, that he's dating the lawyer who handled my eviction. Not just any woman, not just any lawyer, the perfect symbol of his world. Laws, papers, boundaries, structure, control. I saw them once from a distance in a coffee shop, and they looked disgustingly happy and mundane, as if love were a well-signed transaction. She touched his arm confidently. He smiled that calm way that used to belong to me, and I felt a mix of rage and emptiness. Because, of course, the universe rewards those who know how to play the system's game. It left me with empty hands for daring to live differently. I, meanwhile, went through stages of survival that forced me to see my own limit. I tried staying in hostels, then in rented rooms, then in houses of people who claimed to be friends but charged you with glances and judgment. My self-esteem became a fragile thing, not because I believed I was wrong, but because social pressure hits you like a hammer when you run out of resources. In that state, with my head full of noise and the urgency to resolve, I started looking for a big way out, a definitive sign, and I found it in a vision that appeared like traps appear, wrapped in the promise of freedom. I saw an advertisement for a quantum investment course that promised to multiply money with the mind. And for me that made sense because money is also energy. The discourse was perfect, that abundance is blocked by limiting beliefs, that the universe pays you when you vibrate high, that debt is a dense concept you can reprogram. I took it as confirmation that everything I was experiencing was a temporary fall for a giant leap. I invested my last savings without reading too much, because when something is destiny, your mind can't contaminate it with suspicion. I told myself that if I doubted, I betrayed the universe. At first, everything seemed to work because they put me in groups, they gave me phrases, they made me feel part of a financial spiritual elite. They told me I was powerful, that my energy was of a leader, that I was destined to guide others. I needed to hear that, and I admit it, because when the world calls you crazy, you look for a place where they call you visionary. I started posting things about abundance, talking about non-traditional investments, saying that the material is malleable. And the more I talked, the more I convinced myself, because the human mind also self-hypnotizes when it wants to survive. Poetic justice arrived in the most vulgar way. It turned out that the course was a pyramid scheme, not a misinterpreted opportunity, not a project that went wrong, a scam. I realized when they started asking me to urgently recruit people, to bring in family members, to convince friends, to invest other people's money. I resisted at first because I'm not a predator, but they pressured me with the same spiritual manipulation I've seen 1,000 times, that if I didn't do it, it was out of fear, low vibration, internal sabotage. And since I was already cornered, I fell into the trap of thinking that the problem was my mind, not the system. When everything exploded, it exploded all at once, without ceremony. From one day to the next, legal notifications, audits, threats of sanctions started arriving, and they told me I was a founding partner because I had signed papers without reading, believing it was a soul pact. That phrase haunted me for weeks because how ironic that I, who always criticized Tomas's materialism, ended up trapped in the most material thing. Contracts, taxes, the treasury. Debt became a monster with numbers, with dates, with interest, consequences that cannot be cleaned with salt. And suddenly my spiritual life was no longer a refuge. It was a place where I hid while the real world collected from me. I had to take any job because debt doesn't wait for your chakra to align. I ended up in a third-party cleaning company, and the first assignment was the office building where Tomas works. When they told me, I felt like the universe was mocking me as if destiny had a dark sense of humor. The first day I walked in wearing a uniform, with gloves, with a bucket, I saw the same lobby where they had stopped me with my jar and my candles. I saw the guards who looked at me strangely, as if they remembered the spectacle, and I swallowed my dignity because I needed the salary. There I understood that humiliation is the favorite language of dense reality. Now I clean that building several times a week, and yes, sometimes I have to clean the area where Tomas's office is. I force myself to do it with my head held high, even if my throat burns with helplessness inside. Sometimes I see him walk down the hallway with his coffee talking to colleagues, calm, intact, as if nothing had happened. And the most unbearable thing is that he greets me with a courtesy that seems decent, but that I feel like a blow. He tells me, "Good morning, Luna. Be careful with the mop's energy." And every time he says it, I feel like he's reminding me who controls the narrative and who's cleaning up the mess. The lawyer sometimes appears impeccable and looks at me as if I were part of the furniture. She doesn't need to insult me because her mere presence is confirmation that Tomas chose his world and reinforced it with a partner who validates him. Julian completely disappeared from my life, as cowards do when their lie has served its purpose, and I'm sure that in his gym, they continue to tell stories about the obsessed client. Berta probably still lifts weights in territory, and sometimes I think I was just a cardio or surprise in her routine. As for me, I'm trapped paying my karmic debt with bleach and humiliation. And no matter how much I want to see it as a lesson, there are days when it just feels like punishment. I've tried to rebuild my spiritual path, but now I do it with a quieter rage, because I learned that people don't forgive those who deviate from the social script. I still believe there were signs, because denying that would be denying my essence. But I also learned that not every sign comes from above. Some come from your own need to justify the unjustifiable. The worst thing isn't cleaning the glass. The worst thing is cleaning Tomas's glass door and seeing my reflection in uniform, remembering that I once believed myself a woman destined to open minds. And yet, even in this density, something in me still thinks that this isn't the end, but the bottom of the well, because the universe doesn't leave you alive if it doesn't have a plan. But now for the first time I find it hard to distinguish between plan and self-deception. Comments on Update 3. Anonymous User 1 says, "The universe didn't punish you. You crashed alone, cheated twice, stalked, invented a married twin flame, and then fell into a pyramid scheme because you prefer fantasy to responsibility. The only quantum thing here is the speed with which you ruined your life." Opie's reply, "Of course. Because for you everything comes down to cheap moralizing where the world is a straight line and people are perfect or trash. I find it very convenient that you ignore how manipulation disguises itself as spirituality when it suits you to mock, and how the legal system rewards those who have structure, not those who have sensitivity. I don't prefer fantasy. I prefer to believe in possibilities in a world that feeds on itself. And yes, that comes at a cost. If your fun is kicking someone when they're down, that says more about your energy than mine." Anonymous User I says, "Tomas gave you the best possible closure. He left you. You turned everything into ridiculous rituals, humiliated yourself, and now you clean his office. It's not mistaken karma, it's consequence. Hopefully the mop teaches you what life didn't." Opie's reply, "What an obsession they have with romanticizing abandonment, as if it were a heroic act. When what Tomas did was disappear and use his power to crush me with papers and mockery. I didn't humiliate myself. I was put in extreme situations by people who chose cruelty as a method, and they omit that part because it makes them uncomfortable to accept that the world punishes certain people differently. And about the mop, don't worry. The energy of bleach cleans more than the judgments of strangers with accumulated frustration. If your wish is for me to do worse, I tell you that's not justice. It's sadism, and that vibration returns to you even if you don't believe in anything.